If we don't have time to choose to do nothing, then we're really not making choices about doing something either. We're just constantly in this state of compliance with the next thing.
Hi, and welcome to Learning by Living, the podcast about people who learn or work outside of conventional schools. How do self-directed teens prepare for adult life? What is the value of allowing teens to, quote, do nothing with their time? Today, we talk with Katy Burke, a former public school teacher of 11 years who, frustrated with standardized testing, gave up teaching in conventional schools and found work at the Princeton Learning Cooperative. There, she helps teens learn what and live how they want. On this episode, we talk about her journey into self-directed learning, the problems with forced testing, and many other topics. So enjoy the discussion.
Hey, Katy.
Hello.
Hey, Katy.
How are you?
We're so happy to have you on.
I'm happy to be on.
So we always have guests introduce themselves. So if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah. Okay. So I was teaching at a public high school, and I was doing that for a long time. And I just increasingly was becoming more and more disenchanted with it. And for a while, I thought, I'm the problem. I need to do things differently. And there's, every year there's like a whole new set of, this is the new agenda that we're working with. And then after a while, I started to realize that a lot of kids seem to be doing that too, like trying to change themselves to like fit into this thing that just didn't work for them. And they were great kids. So I started to question the system itself, if it really worked for everybody. That happened for quite a while. And eventually, I kind of knew where I stood on things, and I just didn't know how to make a change. And around that time, there was the PARCC testing, which was some states were implementing it. Jersey was one of them. And it was like the mother lode of all standardized tests, and I wasn't a big fan of standardized tests up to that point anyway.
And for listeners who don't know, the PARCC tests were part of I guess that was mapped to the Common Core state standards?
Yes, it was. And it just didn't match a lot of what I was doing in the classroom. I didn't feel like it was something that could, what they were trying to test, I didn't feel like they could test. I mean, to test critical and creative thinking in the realm of English is a pretty hard thing to do with multiple choice tests. And beyond that, it was just really exasperating of a test. And kids were feeling disenchanted like I was, and just disenchanted with the whole business of learning, which was sad to me. And I saw some kids that were kind of spinning their wheels and super anxious, other kids that were just checking out, but were really intelligent and had like really great things to offer in classroom discussions, but weren't working anymore, weren't trying anymore to do anything. And the test process was a big part of that, because everything just started to get more and more data driven. And it wasn't the direction that I could see myself going. So
what sparked you to then switch? How did you find alternatives like Deliberated Learners Network?
It really kind of dropped on my lap. Well, I have to say, I made a promise that I will never tell this story without including God's hand in it, because this whole thing started with a prayer, pretty much. It was during one of my winter breaks from school, and I knew that this test was coming up, and I just started praying about it, and I really felt like God was telling me, don't do this. Like it's not in your conviction to do this. So don't, it's not, my conscience was really weighing heavy on me about it. But, I was super nervous because kids were opting out, parents were opting their kids out, but it wasn't something that teachers were saying, no, I want to be part of this, but I didn't want to proctor the test. So, and I felt like that was the direction that God was leading me. And so it was months before I actually told anybody about it. And finally, I told my principal that I wasn't going to proctor the test, and he wasn't too happy. It led to a lot of write-ups. I had files instead of, they were creating files on me for, basically disobedience and not doing the things I was supposed to be doing as a teacher. But instead of just one act, they counted it for every part of the test that I was supposed to proctor was a different act. So they were trying to create this big file to fire me pretty much. And the difficult part about that was that I was a single mom. I had a mortgage. I didn't have any savings, and I had only worked in one place my entire career. So I didn't know what in the world I would do differently. But I just kept going with it. And it was kind of amazing. Like teachers that I didn't really talk to would come up to me in the hallway and say, I love what you're doing. Or a parent would, or a kid would. I had a girl who really had a big attitude with me the whole year, kind of saw me as just like representing something that she didn't want to be a part of, school. And then when she found out through the grapevine that I was refusing to proctor these tests, all of a sudden she was so engaged in class. So that was pretty nice. And eventually I was just, I was like, I don't know what to do. And I wrote on a parent opt-out, because as I said, no teachers were opting out. And I just wrote what I was doing on some post, and I got 100 responses from people.
Wow.
And one of them said, my daughter goes to this place, Princeton Learning Cooperative. It's really cool. Told me about it. She private messaged me, and she said, they're hiring a new staff member, which was unusual because it's a very small organization. They only have 3 staff, and the application was due the next day. And I saw that at 11 p.m. So I took off the next day and I did the application and sent it in, and eventually I got the job. But I had never heard of PLC before. It was something I that it matched my vision of what I thought education should be, but I didn't think that something like that existed. So it was kind of like finding Hogwarts,
That is an incredible story. Yeah. I love that. I love that. So Kevin got me into this film that is also a book, Beyond Measure. And Katy, are you familiar with it?
Yeah.
Okay, so I was never familiar with it. And I'm still amazed at how the opt-out movement has spurred all these different things, right? It's spurred some people to go the more self-directed route, but it's also just formed a conversation between parents and students about like what's really important in education and how maybe our testing is not serving us. So I love how that's part of your story. I think that's really neat.
Yeah. And I'm not, so rigid that all standardized tests and all tests are a bad thing. But I mean, they have their time and place. And I kind of see it like, if your child's sick, you take them to the doctor, and if you can't tell what's wrong through observation, then you get some blood tests and you try to figure it out. If you have a student who's not thriving, who's not learning, you can't find their strengths, then you start investigating and trying to figure it out. But I don't see any point in testing every kid over and over again, year after year. And the PARCC test went on for 3 weeks, I believe. The first round, there was a March round and then a May round, because it was the first year they were doing it. They wanted to sort of pilot it. And it was exasperating,
So can you tell us a little bit then about the Princeton Learning Cooperative and what really attracted you to it when you found out about what it was, as opposed to what you were in the regular school system?
Yeah. Well, the very first thing that attracted me was the job description, because it was just so relatable. I'd never, I had been looking obviously for jobs, and I didn't know what I was going to do, but all of them were just, this list of sort of euphemisms for tasks that it made it sound like it was this ominous thing that I might not know how to do. And then I thought about it, I'm like, oh, they're just talking about photocopying or something, and it had all these job descriptions sort of had these pretenses, and PLC is not like that. It's just, it's very real. It's very down to earth. And the job description was like that too. And I remember Joel had written, we'd like somebody who can make things happen. What kind of job description has that? So what I love about this place, so many things, but we don't spend any time doing anything that isn't worth it. And therefore, most of what we do is just relating to kids. I mean, I pretty much feel like we're all collaborating in raising these kids, right? Because they're with us half the day, 5 days out of or 4 days out of the week. Actually, we're not open on Wednesdays, but so it's this down to earth aspect. It's the fact that there's so much one-on-one time with kids and small group time. We're getting to know who they are outside of academics. Academics isn't the only thing of value, although it's not devalued either. That's what I find most valuable about it.
So we very rarely have on, or we haven't had on yet, a lot of folks who deal with teens and teen learning. And I can imagine that both teens themselves and then parents, there's a lot of apprehension. Okay, so we've established you don't really have any sort of tests that resemble the conventional school tests.
Yes.
So the first question I imagine that parents would have especially is, well, how do kids learn and how do you know that they're learning things?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, there are no sort of fixed tests or grades. However, if a kid wants to, see if they know something about a particular subject and they ask, we have staff who teach classes and then we have volunteer teachers. They could ask their teacher, could you give me a test? And they'd be happy to do it. So we're not anti-tests or anti-grade. If a kid wants to get some kind of feedback in the form of like a grade, they can do that. But most of them don't because it's not as valuable to have a letter grade. What we do all the time is give immediate verbal feedback. So I find myself working a lot more one-on-one or small classes where just in the moment I can correct, any kind of misunderstanding that they might have about something. If I'm working with them on writing, I would kill myself when I was a public school teacher going through 115 essays, reading through them once for grammar and mechanics, another time for content, another time for flow. And that's just one assignment. And then I'd have to explain that all, and then somehow put a number or grade on it that I can justify this one's an A- versus this one's an A. And it was just silly. But when I'm working with a kid on writing here, I'm sitting next to them. I'm reading it aloud next to them. And I'm like, what do you mean here? Well, I think that what I would do is maybe move this around here. Or do you see how this sounds a little funny? What could we do? It's so much more valuable. So they do get feedback in that way.
I've had a class recently with future teachers, and we were talking about testing and assessment and what would happen if testing was voluntary, because we were reading a writer who said something about, all assessment should be voluntary. And these students were kind of flabbergasted. And the question was, would you ever take a test or an assessment if it wasn't voluntary? And the general consensus was no. And I imagine that the kids at Princeton Learning Cooperative, one of the values is that they can ask someone to assess them. Does that happen, where someone asks you, can you tell me how I'm doing this?
I honestly can't recall a time since I've been here, although we have some kids who will teach classes. So this is actually one of the ways that they could sort of test their knowledge, is if they're really well studied in something, because they do a lot of self-study as well. They're welcome to offer a class if other kids are interested, and then they can get feedback from the kids too, and they can and you have to know the material a lot better if you're going to be teaching it versus being the student. But we have had kids do that who wanted to test each other. So they don't really, I haven't seen them really asking for tests, but they like to give them. So they'll, give a quiz in a class that they're teaching, and, it's more of a fun thing. And I also think this is much more real world. I mean, in the real world, there aren't there aren't really tests or quizzes all that often, right? And if you're on the job and you don't know your stuff, it's evident. And if you do know your stuff, it's evident. So
yeah, I mean, when I was talking with the students in this class, one of the things I brought up is how many people in the room play video games, and several hands came up. And I said, well, if you play video games, you're taking assessments voluntarily, right? Because you can't, and then you ask them, well, if you take away the assessment portion of the video game, the portion that makes it hard to get to the next level, how fun would that be? And everyone's like, it wouldn't be fun at all. It's like, okay, so you voluntarily take assessments in certain situations and you find them enjoyable.
Right.
It's so funny. I have a teacher who takes and gives tests and tells her students, well, this is so you can level up, right? And they really get that language and they really understand that language. So again, I'm like you, Katy. I'm not against testing, right? Or against tests. But sometimes when you were talking about the essay and grading the essay on this minutia that no one would ever in adult life while you're reading, writing would rate you on, seems really not generalizable, right? And I think that the whole point of PLC and liberated learners is to make learning generalizable.
Yeah.
What we talk about all the time in terms of importance for teens, right? It's important for teens to have learning that's real world and generalizable so that when they get out there, they're prepared. So I always see PLC and the work you do as really preparing teens for adulthood, for different types of environments, whether it be college or the workforce, and preparing them well, especially because of the stuff you do one-on-one. And I'm a really strong believer in the power of one-on-one learning, and especially because you allow kids to teach, to actually teach. I think that's so neat.
Yeah, I mean, and to be honest with you, my first year, maybe two, that I was here, I had a lot of adjusting to do myself, coming out of 13 years of being in the public school system, and the idea of having kids lead classes really made me uneasy.
Yeah.
What are we doing here? We need to have some professionalism, was kind of in this latent thing in the back of my mind. But over time, I really realized that it's sort of a performance of what they've studied and whatever skills they've been working on. And that's a better test than anything. What better test of, your acting abilities than performing in the play? What better test of your knowledge acquired than teaching it to a classroom of your peers? That's not easy to do.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. So let's talk about outcomes and outcomes from PLC, and outcomes that you see, right? Because the outcome that we see in public schools is graduation or good grades.
We want to see that kids are capable to make choices on their own, and that they're taking ownership of their time. And it often takes a while because sometimes it doesn't. I mean, we had a girl who came here in her junior year, she was part of a public school, was skipping school most days. The days that she went, she'd often end up in the nurse's office. She really had a hard time even attending classes. Within 2 months of being here, she was teaching classes on her own, participating in everything. And that's the outcome. That is seeing the kid thriving, taking control of their time, pursuing learning on their own, taking that initiative. That's the outcome. So I recently wrote a blog post about the proof in the pudding. And it's an old cliche, and I really pay it much mind, but really that's what we value in life. A diploma doesn't really tell you that. So we're looking to see them doing some of the quote unquote adulting while they're here. And then they usually fly the coop on their own, and that's what we're hoping for.
Isn't that the truth, right? It's amazing. Like they know how to be independent, right? Like people know how to be independent if you let them be.
Yeah. And they come to know themselves better. I mean, I had so many kids when I taught a lot of seniors when I taught in public high school and honor seniors as well. So I was getting, college recommendations, that I had to write up left and right. And the kids were talking to me about the schools they were going to and majors they were picking. And they were so anxious and they just had, I'm applying to like 8 different schools and I'm not really sure what major I want to do, but I was thinking maybe this, and it's just sort of this arbitrary reason that they have. And they didn't know themselves because they never really had the time to do that, to explore the things that they're interested in, to like play up their strengths and just spend some downtime too. It's always this like conveyor belt that they're on to the next thing. So we try to give the kids time to develop into themselves first, figure out who they are first, and kind of become self-actualized. And then they can start really paving their path forward. And that gets, usually more narrow and focused.
So you brought up something that I've been thinking about, and I think Jean and I have talked about a lot, which is the idea of downtime. And I know that being part of a self-directed school myself, when parents come in especially, and they see kids kind of playing or chatting or just hanging out, sometimes even sleeping, the question is, well, how are they going to learn stuff? Like, how is it? It doesn't look like learning. It looks like they're just kind of hanging out. And then you have to figure out kind of an answer to that. And I know that self-directed folks like myself, like Gina, like you, really believe that downtime is actually a pretty crucial part of the process. So can you talk about kind of what you see there? Like when kids don't do a whole lot of purposeful stuff, and I'm using air quotes, like what does that look like? And how, if at all, does that benefit them?
Yeah, I mean, our kids definitely have downtime, that's for sure. Yeah, and that can look differently. Sometimes we do have kids that sleep on the couch. We do have kids that play a lot of ping pong. So there is a lot of downtime. And, again, coming from the public school system, I really think that a lot of this is mindset. So coming from the public school system, I had to adjust to that, and it kind of made me nervous as well. So I think I can sort of identify with parents. I also have, a preteen or teenager and a preteen of my own. So I get the fear. But the thing is, we all need some downtime, and sometimes that downtime is just because we need time for our brains to be at rest so that we can figure out what it is that we do want to choose. If we don't have time to choose to do nothing, then we're really not making choices about doing something either. We're just constantly in this state of compliance with the next thing. And I think even adults feel this without having like a direct authority over them, like a teacher telling them what to do.
100%.
We feel it, right? Because we're always on the clock of like, I have to do this. We're almost in compliance with our own to-do list all day long. And, their responsibility is important. I think the kids start to pick up on that, but I prefer that they come from a place of, I'm choosing to do this thing because it's a great opportunity. It's something I get to do rather than, I have to do this. Life is just about have to. Because then they end up as adults who feel that way 20 years down the road in a job they don't like, So that's what the downtime is really about. And some kids need more than others. And sometimes the downtime is just about social time. I think that we don't put enough value on kids spending time with each other. And adolescence in particular is a time when kids are really trying to figure out who they are as individuals, but they're also trying to figure out where they belong. And this spins some kids totally out of control to depression, anxiety, even, becoming suicidal if they don't feel like they have a place that they belong. And developing those social skills and being a part of a group is crucial. And if they don't have that, learning can't happen. If they don't feel satisfied and fulfilled in the sense that they can relate to other peers, they're not going to be able to focus on learning and getting their work done. So downtime is, it serves a few functions.
I love that. I think that's so important. I just had a conversation with a parent who was concerned about laziness in their child and their teen. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. I personally don't believe in laziness, right? I think if you're lazy, it's another thing that you're feeling, whether it's tired or unmotivated, or I just don't feel like doing this thing now. Right? So if we can take laziness out of our vocabulary and verbalize it into something else, I think that that's really helpful. Also, when we talk about downtime and teens and the importance of social grouping and the importance of social groups to adolescents, I always think about, public schools are really promoting social emotional learning and how important it is. And really, it's the self-directed learning environments that are doing this super well. They're you guys are really doing social emotional learning super well.
Yeah. I mean, thank you. I think the formula for that is simple. It's just giving kids time to be together and not poo-pooing it, not telling them, that, I mean, my younger daughter, when she was, I think, in third grade, fourth grade, in public school, I went to the back to school night and I don't put this on the teacher. It was really coming from the top, from administration, that they had a little snack time, but she said, bring in a working snack, which meant a snack that you could hold in one hand. So an apple, but not applesauce, because that requires a spoon as well. And so that you can snack and chat, but also with your other hand be completing your work. And I think that's how we often think about giving kids time to socialize. It's let's pack it into this little 20-minute lunch period when half the time they have to be standing online to get lunch anyway. And it's not the best environment for kids to be socializing either. They can't really get up and move around. They feel like they're sort of isolated to particular groups. There's a lot of clickiness going on. At PLC, it's a small community. So, although the kids do naturally form into groups, you see the kids, all the kids see each other all the time. And they have to learn to get along with different kinds of kids, because they're the kids that are here and it's a small group. And I think that's a great life lesson. And it's more like how the real world works. So yeah, there's a lot of valuable things that go on socially, and it's not sort of strategic. It's just organic.
So can I transition a little bit into adulthood? Because I imagine that for parents and even for kids, especially as they get older, faced with the idea of going out into adulthood, there could be a concern about well, if I wasn't forced to learn the things that everyone else was forced to learn in school, how am I going to realistically fare? So if I want to go to college, let's say, I need to know these things. Am I going to be equipped? If I want to go to the job force and I need to know things that I would have learned in school, how am I going to be equipped? So maybe could we talk about what the process looks like, let's say just for kids who decide they want to go to college and they haven't had math classes for so long. What does that look like?
Yeah. Okay. So it can look like different things. One, if a kid does want to go to college, if they even want to just keep that on the table, we are upfront with them about what colleges are looking for, and math would be one of them. So if they really want to do that thing, go to college, then even if they're not interested in math, they'll do some math to check the box. Or if they're super interested in math, they'll do a ton of math and they'll do a little writing to check the box so they can go to college. So they're not in the dark about needing to do things. If they wait and, they just keep putting off something that they don't want to do, and then eventually come around to the idea that, oh man, I really do want to do that thing, it's not a really hard thing to accomplish. It's not like there's a shortage of math resources out there. Our kids use Khan Academy a lot, which is a free online resource, and they work with a tutor doing it. And it's straightforward. It's a great program, but they could also do it on their own. And we found that kids, once they get to the point that they're choosing to do something rather than, we're trying to drag them along to do it, or their parents are trying to drag them along to do it, they'll get it done very quickly. You can learn a lot of high school math in way less than 4 years, or 3 years, which is typically the college requirement. So there's that. Also, if they want to go to a 4-year school as homeschoolers, which they're legally homeschoolers at PLC, we help them to create a narrative transcript. We'll also help them put grades on there and credits if the college asks for it, but oftentimes they don't need to. But in a narrative transcript, we're describing all the different things that they've done, and we're putting it into classes that make sense based on the things that they've studied. It's a lot more elaborate than your typical transcript, and I think much more informative as to what they actually were doing. So we have had kids go straight into 4-year schools. We had a kid a few years ago who was really interested in athletics and science. And so he went to school in Colorado. He wants to open up a gym, and he's super motivated, and he had a very rich narrative transcript. And what he was doing during his time here, in addition to, getting done the requirements like math that he needs to apply to college, he was running classes. He was running, exercise classes, and getting all the kids to join him in Spartan races and things like that. So he really was getting a lot of practice and things that, your typical traditional school student wouldn't get. So there's things that they miss. They might not know exactly how to pass back a paper in a row, that sort of thing. Maybe they're not used to that. But they know how to use their time well. They know how to make choices for themselves that they'll find valuable down the road. And so they fare quite well in adulthood. And another method that a lot of the kids do at PLC is they'll go to community college early. And because, different counties have different regulations on that. The one that will have to be 16. But they can start taking a class or two while they're with us. They kind of transition out of PLC. Maybe they go to an afternoon class, so they leave PLC early. And then if they have any problems with the class, we have staff and tutors here to help them with that paper that they have to write or so on. And they go on to college, 4-year college after that, or some work experience. And it's not as scary as it might seem. It's actually, I think, a pretty smooth process.